Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I also grew up on a dairy in Runoff, not far from here, where my family still dairies, and managed one of those dairies for a little bit before joining the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So I've got all kinds of experience there. And to the pressures that Joseph was talking about earlier, I did want to touch on that. When you go to dairy producers and you ask them to do one more thing, food safety or whatever that is, sometimes it's a challenge because they're really facing challenges of economics right now. I know in ag, you guys all know that because we all face those things. Dairy is really facing some of those challenges. So if you're asking more of dairy producers and it's going to cost them more, that's going to be a difficult conversation. They're dealing with animal welfare issues, as you guys have seen, things out in the media, really challenging us on that, and then the environmental things that I'm going to talk about here today. So we're going to jump right into it. I do want to say that this is a very quick summary. I was asked to give a few-minute presentation of topics that are hundreds of pages of regulations that dairies have to deal with. I sifted through those. It's mainly dairy focused. I do have a little bit of feedlot and bovine regulations in here that are very similar to the dairy regulations. But I sifted through those and picked out some highlights where there was an intersection between these regulations for environmental purposes and food safety. But there are definitely a lot more regulations in here that I'm not even getting into because I didn't see much of a nexus with food safety. So I'll just list them out. First is the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and if you're a grower, I am sure you know these guys. They're in the room. They regulate all sorts of discharges to surface and groundwater. If you're managing land, if you own a business and you're dealing with water, you have involvement with them, you know what that means. Local air quality districts. So the state is divided up into local regions. These air districts regulate local sources of air pollution, of criteria pollutants. These are things that are directly harmful to human health. And I'm not talking about greenhouse gases in this case here. That comes up later. The California Air Resources Control Board regulates mobile sources of criteria pollutants. So this would be trucks and tractors and cars and lawnmowers and things like that. And then they also have greenhouse gas regulations that are impacting the state and the dairy and livestock industry. I do want to mention that dairies are regulated as stationary sources by the air districts. And a lot of you, again, if you grow, you're probably familiar with that agency because they regulate farmers also. I do want to say that I do have a Central Valley focus here today. Some of these things are regional. The Air District is regional. The Water Quality Control Board, there's 9 regions in the state, and they're all a little bit different. I'm focusing on the Central Valley for the water quality regulations and on the San Joaquin Valley specifically for air quality regulations. I do want to say that a lot of other air districts, if they've got dairies in their air district, have copied the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District regulations, and so a lot of those regulations look similar, but I am focusing specifically on those 2 areas. So I want to make it clear, these regulations were written for environmental protection, for water quality, air quality, and not necessarily for food safety, with one exception that I'm going to touch on, but that was not the intention why these regulations were written. However, since they regulate manure and how manure is managed and what can be done with it, clearly there's some nexus to food safety and where manure ends up and some of those issues. So the regulations also continue to evolve. I'm giving you a snapshot in time, but this doesn't mean that this is where they're at forever. There's some of this that I'm going to get to, especially on the climate change side, is clearly evolving as we speak, and this is where it stands today, but it could be different in the future. And then I also want to point out that on the Air District and Water Board side, these regulations are enforced through inspections. Regularly, folks come out to the farm, they inspect the dairies, what's happening, how are you managing your manure and your operations, check your paperwork and your records. Are you properly documenting that you're in compliance with these regulations? So dairies do put a lot into this. They hire consultants to help manage these things. It has costs. It has costs for the management. It has costs for the retrofits they need to do. So they are definitely, this is a big thing in the industry, and folks are engaged in it and understanding of what these things mean. I'm going to start with water quality. I've divided up water quality, air quality, and climate change issues. All dairies in the Central Valley are regulated by the Regional Water Quality Control Board for water quality. Most of those are regulated under the Dairy General Order, but depending if you've got a digester on your dairy and you're bringing materials on site for co-digestion, or if you've expanded, or you've built a new dairy, you might be under an individual order. So they might fall under different orders, but all dairies are covered and regulated and submitting reports to the Water Board and subject to inspections as part of that. Feedlots, heifer ranches, and calf ranches are regulated under the Bovine Order, which was recently adopted and is just getting started. A lot of those requirements are similar to the Dairy General Order. There's a couple of differences. My focus is primarily on the Dairy General Order, but a lot of those things got carried over into the Bovine Order, and so beef feedlots, dairy calf ranches are now following these requirements also. And the Water Board is here. If they've got any corrections, anything I'm saying, I would be glad to take, you can jump in at any time and add something to that. I'm going to jump into that one piece, and it's something I don't like to do. It's a lot of words on a slide, but this piece specifically touches food safety. This is the one piece in the regulations that I found that is looking specifically at food safety, and it's in the dairy permit for water quality. When this permit was being developed, I was around and talking to the Regional Water Quality Control Board. They were seen as the only agency that was managing manure at the time. And it was felt that it was important that a food safety aspect be put in there. And so I'll just go ahead and read it. I know there's a lot to it, but I think this is very pertinent to what we're here to talk about, in addition to other things. So waste and land application areas shall be managed to prevent the contamination of crops grown for human consumption. The term crops grown for human consumption refers only to crops that will not undergo subsequent processing which adequately removes potential microbial danger to consumers. So this permit makes it a violation to apply raw manure to leafy greens. That couldn't happen. That would be a violation of this order, and the dairyman couldn't allow that to happen if he knew that that's where the manure was going. Other than this, though, in the general order, there is nothing else specific to food safety. Although some of the things in there do touch it, they don't necessarily address it specifically. Another thing that I think is important to a food safety nexus is that all manure is tracked where it goes. The manure that's applied on the dairyman's land, he needs to say where it was applied, when, and how much. And the manure that he exports off of the dairy needs to be tracked with a manure export manifest. How much manure and where did it go? For liquid manure specifically, there's also a written agreement that's required with a third party prior to sending that manure that way. It doesn't happen a lot because those need to be close to the dairy. That usually is done with a pipeline. Not the case with the solid manure. If you're going to put that on a truck, you can make a deal with the guy the day before. Hey, I'm cleaning my corrals tomorrow. Do you need some manure? That deal can be made, and then it's tracked with a manure manifest. But that all gets submitted to the Regional Water Quality Control Board as part of an annual report. So they see where all manure went from a dairy, the dairy that it came from, and where it ended up going to, who was the receiver of that manure. And I think this potentially is an important piece that you can track that, see where it went, see where it didn't go. Runoff, I know this is an important issue for folks and their irrigation water sources. Justin mentioned it earlier, runoff is not allowed. I took some language from there, but it's prohibited by this order. There are NPDES permits which actually allow discharges in excess of 25-year, 24-hour storm. The dairy WDR that we have is based on state regulations. It's actually just prohibited outright. They do have an NPDES permit available. I don't think there's any dairies under that. I'm not sure why anybody would want that because it is less stringent in this case, but it is prohibited. It must be contained on site. We have ponds that are designed to contain that. An engineer had to evaluate their size, that they're large enough to contain a certain size storm and the surface area that we have on our dairies. If runoff does occur, as Justin mentioned, it is a violation. You're looking at fines, you're looking at enforcement. So there's a strong incentive not to get into that situation. But if you do have that issue, there is a requirement that you sample the discharge, and one of those things is for indicator pathogens that must be sampled, so you'd have an idea of what left with that. The main purpose of manure is for nutrient management. This is a quote from the order there. The land application of manure or processed wastewater to cropland for other than nutrient recycling is prohibited. We can't dispose it. It's not a disposal, dump it on land, get rid of it. We need to manage it as a nutrient source, both on the farms and off the farms if it gets exported. That's the primary goal of where the manure goes. I think it's a valuable nutrient. I think a lot of folks can use it either in a compost form, for example, where pathogens have been taken care of and it's been stabilized. But that is the intent of where we go with our manure to protect water quality. That's it for water quality. I'll move on to air quality. Now, Rule 4550 for dust control with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. If you're growers, you likely understand this rule and are subject to it also. You're going to know a lot of these requirements. It applies to tillage, manure management, feed management, and unpaved roads. The idea is to control dust. And some of that dust could be manure. Could also be just plain dust from roads. But there's a requirement as part of, for tillage that dairy farmers and then also everybody else that farms and tills the ground minimize dust that's created. As you guys know, because it's the same for you guys, it's menu driven. There is a list of options and you have to pick something off of that for that category. If it's farming or tillage, you pick, there's a list of a couple of things. You pick one of those things that you're going to do to minimize dust. There are categories in there for dairies and manure management. Some of those things include frequent scraping to remove potential dust. If that manure is not in the corral, it can't cause dust. Managing manure in the morning hours when there's dew and higher moisture to prevent the formation of dust. Sprinkling of corrals, and Justin mentioned this earlier, downwind shelter belts and boundary trees. Sometimes you see these. Justin also mentioned shades. The idea is have the animals congregate under the shades. It creates a higher moisture area that doesn't create as much dust. The idea with this whole menu is that dust will be minimized from the corrals where the animals are actually housed and moving around. There's a couple others, feeding heifers at dusk when they would be running around and creating dust. But the idea is to try to minimize the amount of dust produced from the animal housing areas. In addition to Rule 4550 for dust that a lot of farms are subject to, dairies are also subject to Rule 4570. The idea here is that it regulates volatile organic compounds of emissions from dairies. After this was adopted, we did a lot of research and found that the most common volatile organic compound is ethanol from silage coming at dairies. I mean, ethanol might be great in a mug of beer, but when it gets into the air, folks don't want that because it combines with NOx and forms ozone, which is a human health concern, and so we're regulated for that. Also, menu-driven options. A couple of things in there. Cover dry manure piles during the winter. The intent with that is that if manure is dry and then it gets rained on, it can restart microbial action, which would reduce volatile organic compounds. And so we're trying to minimize that, but that would also minimize dust off of those piles. And then to incorporate manure into the soil within a specific number of hours of application. This would be helpful, again, if you're a neighbor, that manure gets tilled into the soil and then it's not out there for an extended period of time. And I will move into greenhouse gases now. So this is a fairly new, it's not even in regulation phase yet. It's legislation that passed a couple of years ago. It requires a 40% reduction in livestock manure methane emissions by 2030. This applies to dairies and other livestock operations. We are seeing changing manure management practices as a result of this. We're seeing that there's a target in the future. We're moving towards that target. One of the ways that we're doing this is capturing methane that's produced by decomposing manure in a digester and producing renewable energy with that. Another thing that we're trying to do is handling more of the manure in a dry form instead of a wet form. Manure forms methane when it decomposes in an anaerobic state underwater. And so if we manage more of our manure in an aerobic state, such as composting piles and windrows, instead of in a lagoon in an anaerobic state, we're going to produce less methane. And so we're seeing substantial movement in these areas, I would say. And so you might see that in your neighbors, that there's a change happening in how manure is managed. This has implications for the form of the manure. So if more manure is handled dry, again, it's in a form that can be composted and trucked off the dairy. And then it has implications for pathogens. As manure goes through a digester, pathogen load is substantially reduced. And so I think there's implications there, and we're seeing a whole lot more of that, and especially on larger dairies with the digesters. And I would say we're seeing, as a percentage of total manure, a large percentage of total manure is being treated in a digester because the larger dairies that incorporate those have more of the manure that they're handling. And so these are changes that we're seeing relatively rapidly in the industry that could have some implications on this issue. And that's what I've got. Thank you.